Ladies and gentlemen, we were to have with us now Mr. Alliaz Forum, who is a Lebanese writer and a board member of AFAC that will come in for a short speech. He received yesterday a literary prize, an important one, and he cannot be with us. But Mrs. Rasha Salti, a friend of Mr. Alliaz Forum, and also a curator on our initiative in Germany, is going to make that talk. It's going to be a very short one, after which there will be a small reception here. So I hope you stay with us for this very, very little speech there. Thank you. Rasha.
The title of Elias's text is The Double Exile. I lived in Berlin for 1 year during 2010-2011 academic year as a fellow of the Institute for Advanced Study, during which time I discovered the Kurdish and Turkish neighborhoods of the city. Their bustling vitality with immigrants that had brought over with them their cuisine, habits, and ways of life was enchanting. The city seemed open and humble, ready to embrace different immigrant communities. Although I did meet a number of Turkish and Kurdish political asylum seekers, my general impression was that they were voluntary migrants, people who had come of their own accord, in search for work and better economic living conditions. During that year, I also had occasion to visit Berlin's Palestinian neighborhood, which is quite small, and embodied the tragedy of Lebanon's refugee camps without becoming a spectacle. At the time, most of the Palestinian migration from Lebanon was directed to Denmark. During a short visit to Copenhagen in 2004, I discovered that Lebanon's Shatila camp had found its way to the outskirts of the city and transformed into a cluster of modest residential buildings where survivors of the massacre lived in an almost entirely closed-off ghetto, reliving memories of 2 lost homelands while proudly brandishing their new European passports. But this year, what I found in Berlin is radically different from what I had seen in the past. I arrived at the end of this past September, my mind filled with images of suffering and death in Syria, compounded by scenes of the vast number of Syrian refugees in Lebanon, scenes which are unfortunately filtered through the sectarian contempt, sectarian racist Lebanese discourse that incites contempt and lament at once. My journey was preceded by images of countless death boats filled with Syrians trying to cross the Mediterranean, and scenes of convoy following convoy of refugees roaming the streets of Europe. This time when I arrived in Berlin, I found myself in a Syrian town, haunted by a sense of loss and fear of the unknown, infused by shame of the tragic fate that had driven millions of Syrians into exile. I don't know how one can read this collective exile in which so many Syrians have found themselves in the wilds of the European continent, compounded by a despair that has made of their insistence on survival the sole reason for existence. Are we witnessing a phenomenon that can be called exile? I returned to Edward Said's text, Reflections on Exile, in search of a suitable language to understand this new phenomenon, which had become such a focal point for political and moral debate. Said speaks of the unhealable rift forced between a human being and a native place, between the self and the true home, of how its essential sadness can never be surmounted. Said takes us on his journey through the literature of exile to discover along with him that modern Western culture is in large part the work of exiles, émigrés, and refugees. He stops to consider the experiences of Adorno and Auerbach and others in order to refer to his own exile as a Palestinian. The images of millions of displaced Syrians and refugees today confront us, however, with a different question. Those upon whom exile was forced, not only coming from a country they long for, carrying dreams permeated by awareness and grief, but coming already from another exile, an exile within their own country, fleeing aerial shelling, barrel bombs, and chemical weapons, the extension of a quotidian exile they endured for nearly half a century under the rule of a brutal and repressive autocracy that rendered them strangers in their own land. Reading into this new exile reveals a terrifying truth, that exile is constant, recurring, and never-ending, and that Syria's transformation into an open battleground for regional and international conflicts is nothing more than an indication that the tragedy of Syrian displacement is only set to continue, threatening to trigger a major catastrophe in the region and the rest of the world. I don't wish to simplify matters and claim there is no difference between internal and external exile, and that the tragedy of leaving one's homeland and mother tongue behind to undertake the agonizing effort to integrate into a new culture is not entirely new and To undertake the agonizing effort of integrating into a new culture is not an entirely new and painful layer added to the Syrians' pain of exile. I want to attempt to read the issue from its roots in Syria to avoid confusing the moral and political duty of solidarity with the Syrian people as not merely a relief effort and questions of their integration in the new societies that have received them as refugees. The issue must be brought back to its original context. The tragedy today is one that affects Syrians wherever they are. Perhaps the suffering of those who were exiled within their own country is in fact greater and more painful, and this is where the real problem lies, that we can only see through the lens of one of its main outcomes. The Syrian refugee crisis, despite its importance, is only one consequence, what we might define as the exile of fear and death within Syria proper. The testimonies that have been published about the Tadmor prison, for example, by Faraj, Bayraktar, Mustafa Khalifi, Yassin Haj Saleh, prior to the outbreak of the Syrian uprising in 2011, give us a glimpse of the horrifying machinery of oppression that had transformed the vast majority of Syrians into exiles in their own homeland. Syria was, as the great freedom fighter Riyad al-Turk referred to it, the reign of kingdom of silence, and where a form of republican hereditary rule enforced a machinery of repression, turning the country into an aphasic desert, plastered with images and statues of the dictator. This Syrian exile is one element of the Arab machinery in the region, forged through an alliance between tyrannical military regimes and oil-rich despots. It is precisely from this point that we must begin to analyze the role of the Arab Gulf countries that have played in the region, whether in mounting the counter-revolution in Egypt with the Egyptian army, or in their support of Islamic fundamentalist groups in Syria that are doing their utmost to tear down the banners of freedom that so many million demonstrators carried and marched, and in establishing a new reign of oppression that mimics the Assad regime. The Assad regime, as it shores itself up with Russian and Iranian support. This present-day situation that has propelled the entire region to the brink of a massive Sunni-Shia sectarian war, which can only lead to more catastrophe. I am not looking into the complex course of the Syrian war that has laid bare the flimsiness and meaninglessness of the claim to protection of human life in the context of the unbridled neoliberal capitalist regime that rules our lives in this present moment. But I want to reframe the debate and unearth the roots of this massive exile to Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, and so many European countries. The displacement of Syrians that we are witnessing began first as an internal exile that was soaked in blood for half a century, while the tyrannical regime that was first baffled and powerless when its people flooded the streets of its cities and rural towns. Then it turned Syria into one of the biggest bloodbaths the world has ever seen. The tyrannical regime enforced stringent rules to make of Syria a place of internal exile, walled by silence. It destroyed all the bodies of civil society, specifically trade unions and opposition parties. It set up rules for speech that were impossible to transgress. It eliminated individuals and collectives so that Syrians were not citizens but subjects, and public property was privatized by the ruling family and its cronies. What does it mean to live in exile within your own homeland, to feel that your language is no longer your own and your life forfeited to fear? Internal displacement is permanent fear, the loss of security, and alienation within one's most familiar memories, the complete erosion of space between public and private, and a violation of the human body. All these elements constitute the complex coordinates that lead to the enforcement of silence on all victims. At the same time, they impose the language of the mechanisms of tyranny exclusively. According to Yassin Harsaleh, there is an organic connection between the internalized security function that prevents calling things by their name and the symbolic function that calls things by different names. In the wordless desert of words, the homeland becomes a place of exile, and when victims attempt to break that equation, to reclaim their rights by articulating their own existence, it is that moment in which tyranny blatantly reveals its murderous machinery, forcing millions of people in internal exile to an exile outside the homeland. What we recognize today, the phenomenon of Syrian displacement, is in fact this double exile, the departure from one form of exile to enter a new one. All attempts to offer solutions to this new exile that disregards its root cause, namely the internal exile inside the homeland, are, despite the nobility of humanitarian actions of some, doomed to failure. Syria delivers a new definition for exile, one that begins in the homeland. And when an entire people are made exiles within their countries and strangers within their land, the question of exile moves from one that affects only a certain group of people to an entire population. And the tragedy of mass displacement and migration, the scale of which the world has seen once since the end of the Second World War, namely with the Palestinian Nakba, or catastrophe, becomes a permanent question whose fundamental solution can only be through the liberation of the countries gripped by tyranny and the establishment of democratic values and social justice. Thank you for your attention.